Afternoon, everyone. It's Adrian here from the Fladgate Partnership in Portugal, ready to honour St George's Day with a discussion about our vintage ports, which, by tradition, we have always told the world what we're doing on St George's Day. It's not that old a tradition, but it's certainly one that we have adhered to for at least the last 30 or so years. This year, we had the excitement of launching a wine for both Taylor, Fonseca and Fullcroft. But of course, the unusual part of the story might well be that we are releasing the Taylor as a classic. And for many people, that might come as a surprise, given that we made the 2016 and 2017. So this will be 3 in a row. And I think it's safe to say this is the first time that we have done 3 in a row for Taylors. In the in the 19th century, we did 4 back-to-backs, but we've never done 3 in a row as full classics. So that's the kind of exciting news, and the reason we've done it is purely because that's what the wine dictates, but perhaps I'll come to that in a little while. I think it's probably best to start this by discussing what made 2018 a great year, because like all years, we farm our vineyards with the hope of being able to make vintage port. Of course, we only ever manage to turn around about a quarter of the production of any one of our vineyards into vintage port, but we always farm them with that in mind, with the idea that every grape should have the potential to be vintage port. And but if we do that every year, the thing that makes the difference, obviously, is the weather and the conditions, and that's what really matters from the perspective of what makes a classic or a single quinta. And I think that if we look at the growing cycle from 2018, it came following a winter of fairly high rainfall. If you remember, when we were discussing 2017, we talked about the fact that the River Douro dried up at source in September of 2017. But then in the following winter, there was fairly good rainfall. So we had a fairly abundant amount of groundwater. And then we had, a good summer and good maturation. And indeed, during the harvest itself, the conditions were fairly hot. I recall that, particularly up at Varieties, where we had quite a young group of people picking, we were out making sure they all wore hats and had bottles of water with them, because many of them weren't used to that sort of physical work. In the heat of the Douro in September of 18 was certainly very hot. But the rainfall was a kind of interesting feature of the year, because on the 28th of May of 2018, that was the year that the moment that we had that very high rainfall in Pinhal. That was a Monday evening around 6 o'clock in the evening, where we had at Quinta de Junco, for example, 74 millimetres of rain in a single hour, and most of that fell as hail. And those of you on the call may remember seeing videos of the volume of water in Pinhal. But what actually happened for us that year was Quinta de Junco was in fact wiped out by the hail. So that's one of the Taylor properties, but it was not available for the 2018s. But I think those good conditions of good groundwater, good summer heat, and really all of those coming together have produced what we think is a wine with lots of layers, lots of complexity, lots of structure. But we find it most appealing to have all the multiple layers that we have in this particular year. Now, it's certainly true that since Dick Yateman purchased Fonseca back in 1949, Taylors of Fonseca have always tended to declare the same years. So obviously in recent history that was the the 17s, the 16s, the 11s and the 9s and the 7s and 2003, 2000 and so on backwards. But what we are, what's differentiated, if you like, the Taylors from Fonseca is really the position of Varieties and the importance of Varieties in this particular blend. So Taylors is normally made up of a combination nowadays of wines from Varieties, from Terra Feta, from Junco. As I've already explained, Junco was not in the equation this particular year. But Varieties and the Douro Superior really did particularly well in 2018. And the Douro Superior contributes around about 50% of any Taylor blend. And indeed, at Varieties, we've got a very large quantity of vines, old vines with fairly established root systems. They tend to do well anyway, particularly in hot years. So we're in the situation that the Taylor Classic has come together because we have this quantity of wines from Quinta de Varieties contributing, whereas for Fonseca, the properties of Fonseca are primarily around the town of Pinhão, the three quintas that make up Fonseca blends. And so what we've opted to do is to make it as a Guimarães. Rather than as a single quinta, we make it as a Guimarães. And when we make a Guimarães, we tend to think of something that's a blend that has the same stylistic attributes of a Fonseca Classic, but we expect it to be a little bit earlier maturing. And so we've opted to make the Guimarães, made around about 4,700 cases, which for a Guimarães is a reasonable quantity of vintage port. For the Taylors, just for reference, we've made about 7,800 cases. So that means that we've made more of the 2018 than we did of the 2016 or indeed the 1992, and a little bit less than we made of the 2009s. And then for Croft, Croft is really, all of Croft really comes from the Quinta de Rueda. It's a very large property, but it's in that same locality as many of the Fonseca properties around the town of Pinhão, and the 130 hectares that we have that makes up Rueda. We either make a classic or we make a Rueda. In this particular year, we've decided to make it as a Rueda. So it's really what's differentiating for Taylors is this component that's coming from the Douro Superior. We're also taking a slightly unusual step insofar as with most of the economies of the world shut, with most of our customers at home, restaurants, hotels and so on all shut. We think that this isn't a moment to be commercially launching a vintage port. We feel that the trade is very busy and rightly busy and concerned about a number of other issues, and that a new vintage declaration is probably not what necessarily they're looking for at this moment in time, particularly when the people are focusing on their core business and looking after their key customers. So we've decided to make it, but not to commercialize it until the beginning of 2021. However, what we will be doing is we will be sending out samples to journalists and to key press in the summer once the lockdown is essentially lifted, and we can send these samples out and hopefully perhaps even have an opportunity to meet with some of you on a face-to-face basis to present the wines. So you will have a chance to taste it before the spring of or beginning of 2021 when we tend to commercialise it. But that is the programme, and that is the news today from the Fladgate Partnership. Now, there's several of you, I think, online. I don't know if anyone's got any questions. Patrick, I can see that you're... No question. Any questions? I think last time I spoke to you, Patrick, I was telling you about the snowfall in the Douro at the end of March. So here we are, a few weeks later. Patrick, yeah.
Can you hear me?
I can now. Yes, thank you.
Do you know of other houses giving doing a classic pork declaration? I mean, Naval always releases as effectively a single Quinta, but do you know of other houses doing a similar approach?
Well, obviously, I can't necessarily and make any announcements for companies that have not made their own announcement. I know that, for example, the Symington family have made an announcement where I read it in the drinks business, which talked about, you know, their Quintas up in the Douro Superior. So I think that verifies this point about the strength of that area. You're right to say that Quinta de Noval is a property that makes it every year. It is my understanding that we could well have news about classic vintages coming from the Sograt family, but again, you know, it's their news to tell to people. But I think a lot of winemakers were excited when the 2018 was being made, and I think we will see other houses potentially coming out with it. But you know, we're in the lockdown like everybody else. I haven't had a chance to, you know, talk to many other people, and it's typically not. I mean, despite what perhaps people think, that the sort of pork barons all get together to decide whether we're going to, you know, make a declaration, or we sit in some sort of quiet room and have a discussion. It really doesn't happen that way, and sometimes these conversations might come up over a lunch or whatever. But this year, of course, there haven't been any lunches or activities for the best part of 6 weeks.
One other question, if I may. You mentioned site and old vines. Were there particular varieties in the mix that performed better in Varieties that meant that you were able to make a classic declaration from that property?
Well, remember, the classic is a blend of stuff that's coming from Varieties, coming from Terra Feta, Decimo, Terra Feta, Baixo. So we do get a number of properties coming together. That's the thing that makes the difference on a classic. That's why you get, in a year like this, which are wines quite big, you'll see that when you get to taste them, you'll find that they're quite big, they're quite tannic, that there's a lot of structure there. If you actually look at the analysis on, for example, the anthocyanins, color intensity, you know, they are certainly more intense than the last two vintages that we have made. We don't tend to look at things by grape varieties because, you know, we feel that the way we plant our vineyard is to maximize the potential of the vineyard. Obviously, as I say, in somewhere like Varieties, we've got a very high proportion of old vines. Those decisions about planting were made, you know, 60, 80, 100 years ago. We tend to, as the Taylor company, tends to have a strong planting of Touriga Nacional. That is something that we have historically done. But we've also tend to have quite a high level of plantings of Tinta, which provides a lot of backbone and structure, which is often what people look for in Taylors. So I don't have specifically varietal data, but what you will find in a year like 2018, with warmer conditions, which was generally good across the valley, even down to the Baixa Corgal, you would find that grape varieties like Tafriga Française, or Tinta Franca sometimes it's referred to, and Roriz, which is the Tempranillo, of course, of Spain. Those two varieties are probably the most widely planted varieties in the Douro. And in the climatic conditions of 18, both Roriz and Française will have done fairly well. And you'll see that actually when you get to taste, I think, some of the Douro, DOC Douro table wines from 2018. You will find that most of those tend to be made of a mixture of Roriz and Française. And you'll find that it's been a very good year for both those grape varieties.
Thank you.
No.
I'm happy to let someone else ask questions. So.
Okay, so we'll see who else is online. Thank you, Patrick. Everything well in London?
Yes, fine, thank you. It's actually very hot. The last time we exchanged, you were showing me pictures of snow.
Absolutely. The rather bizarre weather this year has been unusual. This year, what we've seen in 2020 is that bud burst actually happened on the 3rd of March. Now, an average bud burst for us in the Douro Valley is about March 15th. So this year we're about 2 weeks ahead, and what's significantly important is that we're actually further ahead than we were in the 2016 harvest. So if the viticultural cycle continues as it currently is, we will in fact be picking a harvest in late August, which will probably be the earliest on record. So it's, we're only in April, it's a bit early to tell, but we have gone from this fluctuation of early bud burst. We then had a little bit of snow on the high altitudes in the Douro, which is unusual, and reminds us, of course, that climate change is still with us, even if hopefully COVID won't be with us for very much longer.
And possibility for a 4th classic declaration.
Well, obviously the 4th classic would be, you'd be talking about the 2019s, which has obviously was made last year. We have tasted those. We've made some good wines. We always make good wines, but I think that probably, unless the wine dictates, as in fact it has this year in 2018, I think it would be unlikely.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so I think we've got Richard Mason just joining us online there, who is popping in. I assume you're up in your... Richard, are you there? Richard.
Oh, hello. I wasn't expecting you, Adrian. It suddenly appeared. I think actually Patrick asked the question I was going to ask about grape varieties, and you've answered it very thoroughly. So,
okay.
But congratulations on the 3rd declaration in a row for Taylors. I think that's wonderful.
Yeah, it's exciting, and it's certainly, I was looking back in the decade, the first decade of this century, between 2000 and 2009, we made eight vintage ports. Now, 4 of them are classic, and another 4 of them were very good single quintas. So it's kind of interesting. You look, we had 8 in that decade. In the decade of the 90s, we had 7 vintage ports, whether they be classic or single quintas. In the decade of the 80s, as you'll remember, Richard, because you've written books about it, in the 80s there were 8 vintage ports as well. So again, 3 of them classic, and in fact 5 of them were single quintas, but all very fine wines. And I know that many people still go back and wonder why the 87 itself wasn't made, because possibly that wine justified it. And I think that draws us to this point of, why are we doing this? Well, we're doing it because the wine is dictating. We'll then deal with the commercial side separately, and quite frankly, as a company that's got 40 million litres in stock, another 70 or 80,000 of classic vintage port bottled and in cellar isn't going to make a lot of difference. It's all about the quality of the wine, and yes, we've had 3 come along in a row. It's unusual, but maybe it's testament to the work that David Guimarães and Antonio Magalhães and other people are having on our team, and indeed just the general approach we're seeing in the Douro, which I think every year is better, gets better and better.
Absolutely. Oh, good. Well, congratulations. I think only Coburn's has done something similar. They did 15, 16, 17. Again, 3 in a row for a bit of the big houses.
Yeah.
It's a very rare occurrence. So wonderful, good news.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
Now, William, I think you're on. William Lyons. A question coming through. William, is that you there? One feels like a sort of radio presenter.
Hello, Adrian. Hey. From sunny
William.
London. How are you? No, I think you've answered all my questions, actually. Just to say as well, congratulations.
Thank you.
I suppose on a layman's point of view, if you knew nothing about vintage port, and I think you've explained it anyway, you might ask, why are we getting all these declarations? Is it the weather, or is it just improvements in viticulture?
Well, look, I think there's quite a number of reasons. I think certainly the climate is one factor. But I think also that the approach we take these days perhaps is a little bit more scientific. We do break down making port into all the numbers of small steps, and we pay attention on each step. And it's a bit like I think the British cycling team had that approach in terms of how do they start to win records by simply, breaking everything down to a series of key moments and seeing if you can improve each little one, and then the sum of all those small changes adds up to the difference. And I think if you look at the viticulture, if you look at the planting the right varieties in the right place, if you look at the moments of treatment, if you look at the fortifying spirit that we use and the attention that David has with his annual tastings in Bordeaux, which again this year I'm not sure he's going to be able to go to Bordeaux to taste the spirits for this coming harvest. But if you look at all these sort of small steps, we take each one very seriously. So perhaps it's not surprising that we're getting a quantity of vintage port each year. And to make 7,800 cases, to say more than we made of the 16, more than we made of the 1992, around about the same we made of the 2009. That's a decent quantity of vintage port.
No, it's excellent news. As a port lover, as a vintage port lover, it's good news.
Great. I think we're going to be challenged by this whole 2020 because we're at the moment making careful steps as to see what we can do to run a harvest where conceptually foot treading with the proximity of people in a lagar may well be something that we don't wish to do because of safety of our workers. So we are in a very rapid process to mechanize the lagars at Varieties so that we can actually do something, actually use the Varieties winery, and then of course trying to make all the other changes necessary to keep our staff safe. So it's kind of interesting that we are now very much in a very detailed harvest planning simply because of coronavirus. But I digress because this is really about 2018.
No, but that is an interesting point, actually. Great. And is this a first for Taylor's as well, having 3 in a row? It's an absolute...
Yes.
Yes,
We've done 2 in a row before, but this is... Dick Yateman occasionally made a pipe of stuff for a godson or whatever. So sometimes we do find things turn up which we didn't even know had been made. But actually, yes, officially, this is certainly the first time we've had 3 Taylors in a row. And as I say, the other times when we had 2 in a row, we have to go back to the 19th century to find examples of that. So it is unusual, but
it's a collector's dream, isn't it? It'll be a wonderful comparative tasting in 50 years' time.
Yeah, I absolutely. I think that's right. And I think when we were talking about the 17s and 16s, we were talking about the fact that they are both stylistically very different. I suspect that people will want to know, does the 2018 sit more closely to the 16 in style or more closely to the 17 in style? And our view is that it is more closely to the 16. In other words, it's got that real structure and power. What you saw with the 17 was a sweeter opulence that came from the in the 17s and in the 16s and in the 18s. The 18s really have got this very big and powerful structure, which will imply, quite rightly as you said, that if people do comparative tasting 20 years into the future, these wines will still be shown exceptionally well.
Yeah. Well, thank you.
Hey, thanks very much.
I look forward to tasting them.
Receiving a sample at some stage.
Yeah. The samples are arriving.
You're getting them, okay? Good. Well, we
things,
these out when we can, but the process is that we put the lot together. We'll be bottling in July, and hopefully all this lockdown will be over by July, and we can be able to send out samples to people, or indeed come and, as I say, come and visit and taste with people as well. so that people can see side by side how this looks in comparison to the 16 to 17.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, thanks, Will.
Thank you.
Right, I think, Adam, you're coming through with Adam Lechmere. You're on the line, and I'm being told in my ear that Adam, you here? No? Yes, Adam.
Sorry, was I supposed to do that?
I don't know what you were supposed to do. You apparently have joined, and you might have a question. So
I did. I saw the press. I didn't want to cut Will off, though. Will, I'm sorry if I cut you off there.
No, I think he'd had his question answered, and he'd gone off for a glass of port to recover.
Good. So congratulations, Adrian. And I like your optimism in saying you could possibly meet a few people face to face by the summer. I don't know if that's going to happen.
Well, we certainly hope, but let's see. Yeah.
Optimistic. My question is quite. I just wondered, having seen many Dom Perignon vintages being declared over the years, and Richard Geoffroy, I remember him saying that he thought that it was Dom Perignon's responsibility to declare a vintage champagne as a witness to the vintage. And I thought it was quite a clever way of putting it. But I wonder if we're going to be seeing more. I mean, Patrick asked you about 2019 and moving forward. Do you think we're going to be seeing more of these classic and vintage declarations as the decades go on?
Well, I think, as I was trying to say in my earlier response, is that the conditions that we have in terms of the attention to detail that we are paying to every single step in the process probably increases the possibility, not necessarily the probability. So yes, of course it is possible we'll see more. I don't know whether in fact it will or won't happen. We as you can imagine, have debated very strongly this idea of a third one in a row, given that it is fairly unique. And certainly the first time in Taylor's history, which spans over 3 centuries. And we felt that irrespective of coronavirus and all the other issues that we're all well aware of, we've got to let the wine speak. We've got to be true to our quality ethos, and if it's there, we should make it, and then we'll figure out whether we sell it or not sell it. And that's really why we're taking the approach we're taking. And I'm sure that process will happen as much in future years. I would hope that we are, declaring more. We hope to declare, obviously we always hope to declare at least 3 vintages a decade. This year so far we will have declared 4. We declared 4 in the last decade. So, that is a slightly higher frequency than in the past. And, maybe when we get into the 2020s, we shall see. But the fact, for example, from our perspective, the fact that we don't think we'll be able to do any foot treading in 2020 because of physical distancing. I'm not going to say social distancing, because when we at a farm like Varieties, typically all the people there come from one village. They are often members of the same family, so they are socially close but physically distant. We won't be able to tread. We believe treading adds that extra 1.5–2% to the quality. So, the probability on 2020 is low, simply because one of the factors which we would regard as being very important, which is foot treading, isn't going to happen. So, there are going to be issues as we look forward, and that's why we can say, the possibility is there, but we simply can't make bigger predictions than that.
That's interesting, and it's very interesting to see that you said that you're going as fast as possible to get the mechanised foot treaders in at Varieties. And they're pretty sophisticated pieces of equipment, aren't they? I mean, were you quite far down the line in getting them in there, or are you suddenly deciding you're going to put them in?
No, well, we have been discussing this previously. We've had this conversation, but one of the things we've always judged that at Varieties, we have a large resident population because of the remoteness of the property, and therefore we've always had the labour available, and we always feel that it's good to occupy that labour in the winery, because that becomes the social centre of activity every evening. But we've clearly discussed the issue in the past about mechanisation. So a month ago we've dusted off the plans, and we've gone full steam ahead. And indeed, one of the other parts of this, because of someone like Varieties, where there is a large resident population, not only are we dealing with the winery, but we have been able to make an approach to the railway company about a month ago to look to rent the old station so that we can have increased accommodation, so that the physical spaces in which our staff are actually accommodated is in fact also giving them more space and more distance, and that again I think is a responsible thing that we should be doing as an employer of these people for the harvest. And I think it's going to be a very key factor when we come through the other side of this coronavirus, is rethinking how people and proximities of people will work. Probably to our advantage is that in somewhere like Fladgate, we do have people all coming from one village. They know each other. It's interesting to see that we have a big construction project on at the moment, and it's very interesting to see that different companies, different subcontractors will only work anywhere near people from the same subcontracting company, and they won't be near another company because they don't have the sort of same level of trust as the people they already know. And so that's going to be an interesting thing, seeing how that plays out, and certainly how that plays out when you're mobilizing 420 people, as we do each harvest, to pick grapes. People are going to be next to people that they know.
Thank you very much, Adrian.
Yeah, pleasure. Thank you very much indeed. Thanks for joining. And I think we've got Josh. Parts of to these new types of technologies, and I think all of us, probably every single one of the people on this call, well, many of you are journalists, you're probably more used to remote working and this sort of thing in the past, but for many of us this is a very interesting new use of technology. So Peter, are you online? No. This cough is not caused by anything other than probably a lack of a glass of port. So let me. A little bit of the 18 there. So I think we had Peter Dean, who was joining us again from the UK, but had his questions answered already. And I think, Andrea, you're still trying to ask a question as well. Andre. Hello, Andre.
Hey, how are you?
I'm very well indeed. Yourself?
Good to see you. I'm good. I'm good too. Congratulations on the declaration. It's good to see, of course, new vintage being declared. It's always a pleasure to have quality being declared. I think it's a good and positive sign to the port wine industry. I was wondering, how you see, of course, the big question of, for the first time, declaring 3 years in a row, for people who don't follow the industry that close. Do you think consumers will question whether this is being done out of necessity, or is this being, I'm wondering if for someone who doesn't understand how things work, if 3 years in a row might be something that they're questioning. What about the thing of doing 3 years per decade? What is happening now? How do you see consumer reacting to this kind of thing?
I mean, the slight, if I may point out, the slight inconsistency of the question, and if they know enough to know that vintage port is only declared 3 times a decade,
You're right about that, of course.
They may well be available to understand that we only make it when we have the quality, and therefore the quality is there, and that's why we've made it. I think for a general consumer who knows nothing about the port industry, they probably wonder why we don't make it every year anyway. And so, I think what will happen, of course, is that we've tasted it, we have declared it, we've made our decision. I'm sure many observers, with many of you who follow us closely as an industry and as a company, will want to taste this and pass your own judgment on how the 2018s compare to the 17s and indeed the 16s. We hope to give you that opportunity shortly. But I think for general consumers, the feeling would be that if it's made by tailors, that they're putting their name on it, and they're prepared to stand by it in terms of being something of the quality they want to call vintage port, they will accept that. And if they're hugely knowledgeable and know about 3 times a decade, well, we can probably persuade them that it's all about the quality.
My other question is about stocks. So retailers and people who are selling wine, they've been buying 16s, they've been buying 17s, and now they have 18s available. Do you think this will make them buy less? And so they still have stock available. Now we have this problem where it's, of course, sales of wine are down in Europe 30 to 50%. Do you think this will push? So it's one of the reasons, of course, you're pushing sales to 2021. It makes all sense. But do you think this will have a big impact on what is being sold even in the beginning of 2021?
Well, I think you're absolutely right to point out the fact that many wine shops are closed, and they have got existing stock, and sadly some wine shops may or may not be able to reopen. It's quite possible that some people will be sadly not be able to after this, and then we don't know what they will do with their stock in those wine shops. They may liquidate it. There may be more stuff comes onto the market. So I think the answer to your question is that clearly, if the quality is there and the demand is there and people like the wines, they will make a purchase. If in fact they feel that they've got too much stock because they've been badly affected by this close down, then they may well not purchase. Arguably it's not the end of the world. Not everybody has to purchase every vintage. And nowadays, with what we've seen with this particular close down all over the world, has been a very large increase in internet activity, internet wine sales. And so if we do offer it, I suspect that the end consumer who's looking at it may well be choosing to place their orders through internet, which may well mean that the demand is more visible before we decide to supply. So I think your question is very good, and I think it's a very general question, because of course it'll affect all of the wines we make, not just a new vintage port.
My last question would be, I've seen last year you've released new limited production ports. Do you think in the future we'll have more limited, so new editions and new single vineyards and new what I mean, instead of relying on 2 or 3 main vintage ports for each house, do you think we'll have more single some of these limited editions, and like you did last year with Greco's and some of the others?
I think again, what we saw in 2017, where because of the climatic conditions, the old vines particularly produced very well, and that obviously allowed us to make a lot of the Vagelas Viña Vella, but also to produce Sericos from the old vines of Croft. I think that was connected to climate and old vine production. I suspect that it's always difficult with things like climate to look at the long cycle by looking at just what's happening in the short term. But for example, as I've already mentioned, this year bud bursting earlier than we've had, and a couple of weeks earlier than on average, suggests that there is still an influence of warming conditions, and that probably still will favour old vines. So I suspect we will see more of those old wines, collector's items being produced. But I think the other point that's important to stress is that nowadays the vintage port market is global. So if we look at the amount of where our customers are for tailors. We sell in 103 countries around the world. We're making 7,800 cases of this. So, when you start to spread that around 100 or so markets, there's not a lot of it to go about.
Yes.
And it becomes even more rare when you get into those smaller bottlings. So, there is a point at which some stuff that's so small that it may not be commercialized. But I think, I think it will be to the future more. You will see more quality coming out. I think the Douro is being farmed better, and I think all ports, whether it be reserves or LBVs or whatever, age tawnies, all of these I think are getting better. And I think there's generally been a strong improvement in quality of all ports in the last couple of decades.
Lucky us. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thanks for your questions. Great.
Thank you.
So, Dave, I think you're coming through from Washington. Dave McIntyre? No. We've got Peter. I think you're trying to make another question. Then I think we tried to get you online earlier. Are you there, Peter Dean?
Oh, hello, Adrian. It's Peter Dean here, not Dave.
Hi.
Hi, how are you doing?
I'm very well indeed, yeah.
Good,
Great.
good. Congratulations on the declaration.
Thank you.
Most of my questions have already been asked, but I just had a few small ones, which was, when did it last happen that Taylor's declared and Croft and Fonseca didn't?
So that has not happened since Fonseca and Taylor's has been under the same ownership. So Fonseca was purchased by Dick Yateman in 1949, and since then we have had they've always declared at the same time. So this is an unusual step, but as I say, it comes because particularly of the fact that we got the Douro Superior and we don't have the Fonseca property up in the Douro Superior. Maybe we need to rectify that.
Right. Okay. And with the Guimarães, excuse the pronunciation.
Great.
Is the do you think generally that the market is preferring port that can be drunk sooner rather than having aging, with a new demographic coming into the market? That sometimes a more sort of precocious port is a good thing for the market?
Well, yeah, I think it's a good observation that you're making, because we do see that in other wine regions of the world. I mean, if you look at people liking the sort of higher alcohol Shiraz wines from Australia or some other new world where you have these very big, robust wines that attract consumers. And I think the reality of vintage port is that the way it's being made, the quality of it these days is that you can appreciate it at different ages, but for different reasons. So, it's a young vintage port. They're real blockbusters. There's a lot of powerful fruit. Obviously, as that gradually ages, it changes. And some people prefer it old, and some people are liking it young. I think the other point is that for example, people used to drink their claret a lot older than they do today. But one of the reasons people can't drink old Bordeaux has been inaccessibility from a point of view of price. They've become too expensive for most people. The interesting thing about vintage port is that there's still great ports available from the mid-80s, the mid-70s, which is still at a relatively affordable price. So people do have this luxury of being able to taste young ones and indeed old ones and be able to decide what is their preferred style of how they like to drink it. But you're right. There has been a change, and there certainly are people who like to drink fruitier, powerful young wine.
Okay. Thanks very much.
Well, thank you very much, Peter, for your questions. So I think we have Nick Nick Poletto coming in from. Nick, are you there? You're joining us, I think, from Westchester, which I think was an early epicenter. Nick? No. Nick, hello.
Adrian,
Nice to see
how are you?
Nice to see you.
Congratulations. This is exciting.
Thank you.
Wow. I was just reminiscing with some of the other co-brand managers about the wonderful time I had out there a couple years ago as it's snowing in April here in New York.
There you are. It's all strange these days.
But glad everyone's well. And you answered many of my questions. I was most curious on how the increase in obviously these past few vintages in terms of quality was going to affect all the other wines as well in the portfolio, including even some of the aged tawnies, how this was going to potentially in the future affect those.
Well, I think you're right to point out that, or perhaps to suggest that in years when we make a vintage port, it's because the overall year has been very good, and we're obviously just selecting the very the top of the top of the production to be the vintage port, but everything else in those years has been very good. So I think if you look at, for example, late bottle vintages, when we start to move into the 2016 late bottle vintage, which will be probably in the summer of 2021, we're then going to have a run of very exceptional late bottle vintages that'll see us through for 3 or 4 years. So I think all the investments, whether it be in the vineyard, in the wineries, and everything else, and indeed the climatic conditions that's allowing us to produce vintage port, is allowing us to make better port, and that impacts the majority of what we make, which after all, 95% of what we do is other styles of port than vintage port. So yes, it's a great point. Port's getting better.
One last question I had is knowing, obviously the premium quality that you guys are and how historic of a moment this is, I would be curious to know what was that initial conversation you had with David, maybe, when he said, Adrian, I think we got something special again. Like, when did that moment happen where he said, I think we're going to be declaring again?
Well, the process of a declaration obviously is during the harvest of 18, we were aware that we were making something very good. We were aware, obviously, of the conditions we were tasting in the harvest. The way that we construct a vintage port is the entire tasting panel, which is 11 people, start back in February, assessing all of the component lots. So this is a journey which all 11 of us have been involved in, rather than any one person coming along and saying, well, this is it, here's a blend, should we declare it? And I think, the exciting point is that throughout this accompaniment, and I have to say, it hasn't been easy to do vintage port tastings in the sort of shutdown that we've had. But nonetheless, all of us have come along this journey, and we reached a decision of saying, this really should be declared. This is amazing. And then there was, well, hang on, there's a world crisis and so on and so forth. This isn't the right moment, perhaps, to make another vintage port. But then when I look back and say, well, we made the 2007s and we launched them in April of 2009, which was around about 3 weeks after the S&P bottomed out in the last major crisis. Mm-hmm. Or when we made the 2011s and we launched those in Portugal, which at the time was under the control of the European Bank, the IMF, and was in a very bad place actually as an economy. So the economic cycle does what it does. We have to follow the wines. I think the conversation we've had is, look, this is a great wine. If we didn't make it purely because of coronavirus, that would be not being true to our quality standards. We've got to make the wine that's there, and if it is a classic, we'll make it as a classic. Again, we'll figure out how we bring it to market. When we bring it to market, we'll do that. That isn't the point. The point is that we want to make these wines when they come along. We don't know when the next is coming, and we do want to make them when they come along, and that's why we've made it.
Oh, that's exciting. Thank you. Great to see you. Congratulations as well.
Thank you very much, Nick. Great to see you. Okay, so I'm getting a question coming through from various things. So have you spoken? Okay, so the question really is coming asking about the volumes and just looking at how these volumes compare to prior years. So just to remind everyone, what we're saying with the Taylor, for example, we make 7,800 cases of this. We made about 12,000 cases of the 17s. We made 6,200 cases of the 16s, 10,000 of the 11s, and so on. So 8,000 of the 2009. So it is within the sort of level that we have seen in recent times. In fact, if you want to look for a moment when we go back to see the last time we made a lot of vintage ports in a single year, that would be going all the way back to 1985. In 1985, we made 27,000 cases. So, you know, the average, I think, since post-war average is we've made around 16,000 cases for Taylors. But in the last decade, our average would be sitting at around 9,000 cases. So there is a little bit increase in frequency and a little bit less volume coming through. And if you look at, you know, Guimarines, 4,700 is very much in line with the sort of volume that we make for Guimarines when we make it. There's been a few occasions when we've gone above that. The last time we had a much bigger Guimarines was back in 1986 and indeed 1995 and 1986. So this is in line with that. And then for Rueda, you know, Rueda is a 2,000 cases, which is very much in line with what we made from the in 2016. I think 2016 we made about 2,700 cases. This time it's 2,000 cases, so it's similar. And then another question coming through, which you know, I don't want to sort of repeat myself too much, but I think the other point was, you know, is this going to mean good LVVs? I think the answer to that is yes. So now I've got coming through live, I think, is Mariana. Mariana, are you there? The technology. No, I think Mariana, you've slipped off. But if you do have a question, please, if you are online and you do have a question, then and you can't get through for some reason that this isn't working, then by all means email me and I can answer, or email your contact within the Fladgate partnership if it's not me. But hopefully most of you have got my email, and I'm very happy to answer any questions that you might have online. I think we've still got some people coming through from the States. I'm being signaled that there's someone trying to get through. But if that doesn't happen, okay. Well, look, I think if anyone's still online, thank you for being patient and listening to this presentation. As I say, we sincerely hope we will be back in front of you in person to taste wines of this quality in the future. We won't forget to show you these live and to send you samples so that you can make your own assessments of these wines. But it's exciting news. St. George's Day always brings, you know, for us an exciting day. But on a day like today, with so many of our customers around the world with their businesses closed, you know, the joy of a new vintage is to some degree, I think, tempered by concerns for the health and well-being of our customers. So thank you all for being online. Thank you all for listening, and I look forward to seeing you in person on the other side of this problem. So thank you very much.